Okay, so the goal now is to open for a general discussion, and Stephen used a phrase at the beginning of his talk that I want to come back to, and that's feeling like a fish out of water, which to me means that this is a successful collection of speakers on a topic that's important in the future of nutrition, that we have in fact brought together people here from different disciplines, different experiences, all focused on this challenge that I think we have always faced in our field. How do we assess what people eat? How do we use that information to make recommendations that can in fact use nutrition to promote health? So we got to start with Regan with sort of that topic that we think we know something about, and I think increasingly we're learning that. I love that picture with the microscope, the telescope to the Hubble, where what we thought we knew, once we keep getting better tools, better ways to approach it, we keep expanding what we do know, but also the challenge of what is ahead of us. So, and I mean, some of the areas that we've hit upon that I think are critically important, and I hope we have time at the end of the panel where each of the panel members can, in fact, comment further. The challenge we face with our systems for collecting and analyzing, we've heard variations on that, making sure that the data that we have is, in fact, reliable. How do we validate that? What are the vulnerabilities we're creating? This question of how do we think about the individual, how do we think about population, but within that then how do we also think about subpopulations and what defines those subpopulations? And of course that final step in the process that we're trying to get to, how do we motivate consumer behavior? How do we use this information to make sure that we're moving in the right direction? So we're gathering a lot of cards. We're probably going to have a hard time sorting through, but also you're free to use the microphone. So if anyone wants to come to the mic, please. So do you? Okay. So one of our first questions was about, rather than using scans, what can we do with receipts? And I think we've had mention of using receipts. Perhaps to amplify on this question, if use of receipts is going to be a useful way to collect data, how do we need to transform that kind of data information so it's in fact a useful and reliable tool? What is there now? What do we need to be able to get? Do you want to tackle that one first?
I can take that. All of you have had experience with receipts when you pick it up and the abbreviations make no sense whatsoever. This is particularly true for stores, ethnic stores, where you go in and you pick up and it's just item 1 and gives a price. Having said that, we were able to even leverage those. So people could scan and send the information, and we immediately get back to them, says this makes no sense, and what is this? And we ask people to annotate information on their receipts, whether it's food at home or food away from home. And so we used it in that capacity. After all of this was said and done, we came across a program that you could feed the receipts into. It breaks it down into a format, and character recognition can use that information there and try to match it to the data set you're running in the background. It wouldn't come back 100%, but at least you would take some of those out, and then you identify the holes you have, and you go after them very quickly with the respondents.
I do have a question for Dr. Lee. I think there's a lot of interest in your new mobile app game, Sim Obesity. It'll be interesting to see if it becomes a bestseller, I suppose. But the question really has to do with what aspects are the most challenging to capture and what aspects introduce the most bias. So really thinking about the challenges in building that model.
Well, I guess it's hard to give a single answer to that. So I can, this is not working. Is this better? Okay. We're very close here. So I guess there's several challenges. So one is you're dealing with data and systems at different scales, right? So you're dealing with the interaction between biology and an individual behavior, and a larger scale is environmental, and then policy, economics. So they're at multiple scales, and many times data is not necessarily collected across the different scales. So you have to draw some of those links between those. That may change in the future, but even when people think about big data sets, they often still are at a single scale, and part of it is really merging those. Secondly, certainly behavioral data has a lot of potential variability, and if you're collecting information on particular populations or particular people, the question is do those behaviors hold across multiple people? It is true that information is stochastic and the data is stochastic, but there are many other industries and professions that have dealt with as stochastic or even more stochastic data. So I don't think that's necessarily insurmountable, and in fact, modeling can be a way of bounding the box and showing, okay, how important are certain types of behaviors.
I have more questions for Stephen, and I have to say, when Richard asked his question, I thought you were going to get into, do you just put the smartphone on the dog and so you're walking the dog? But these questions really have to do with privacy, and I think it may be a question that others on the panel might like to address as well, because you are collecting data then 24/7. So how do privacy and safety get sort of folded into the thinking about this big data and the collection of big data? So I'll let you start and maybe ask others to comment as well.
So this always comes up, and it's a complicated issue, although I actually don't think it's as big of a barrier as many people think in meetings like this. One thing to remember is that this type of data is already being collected essentially. It's just that companies are doing it without people really understanding what they're doing. And so as researchers, we're to some extent held to a higher standard. And that's one of the things that even the big precision medicine initiative is going to have to struggle with. How do you both explain to people the benefits of giving up this information for the sake of science without scaring them so much about all the possible things that could go wrong with it, that nobody wants to give up the data. So I guess I have sort of roughly two answers to the question. One is that I think in the short term there are plenty of people who will assume the risk for the sake of science and give up the data as long as there's reasonable protections for it. And then in the long run, we just have to make sure that people are always well informed about how this type of data is being used and who's using it, and make sure that they maintain a sense of control over it. But the bottom line is there's all sorts of data about you already that's being used by big data systems developed by industry, and I think that the health field, particularly public health, is far behind that. So I would hate to see us not attempt to do this, especially given in our case we're always just doing it with informed consented participants. If they're willing to consent to it and we explain to them clearly what's going on, then that should be a sufficient sort of risk-benefit trade-off.
So, Mark, did you want to comment on the
Yes, I wanted to say that Stephen is quite correct. Food ads data are quite sensitive. We have geocodes after all. And so even if we remove the geocodes, because you know the distances where people are shopping and what they're shopping, you can triangulate an item, and we've exercised that. But when you collect information and you tell people that your data will remain confidential under informed consent and control the use, and we tell them it's going to be used for these purposes, the burden is on us then to make sure that that really happens. But if you accept that cost, then you can really make sure that something like that doesn't happen. The other thing I want to say is, I love your presentation. We've already started on food apps too, and we are trying some things, and we have given people smartphones, and we are collecting that sort of information, and we had no problem with informed consent for 500 people to provide their data. So.
They'll generally be more concerned about their battery life than anything else. Honestly, I mean, in total seriousness, what they care about is their battery life and that you're not impacting their use of their technology.
Actually, though, having gone through some of the big data breaches with the U.S. government, I would also anticipate they might be concerned about, can I trust you when you say you're going to keep it confidential?
Yes.
But Regan, did you want to come? Dr. Ordovás, do you want to? Because the genetic information, that's another area where privacy becomes a factor.
Yeah, that's precisely. It seems to be that genomics appears to be more sensitive than other information, but I mean, as scientists, to me, genomic information does not provide much more than metabolomic information or things like that. So it's a matter of educating people. I mean, I was thinking about what you said before. Every time that we get into our computers and we do a Google search, we just open our intimacy entirely, because the next minute on the side you have all kind of advertisements about what you just did the search, right? And so, considering that we are doing this for the benefit of people, I think we should just set the barriers a little bit, maybe lower, in terms of protection.
Dr. Lee, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think, as Stephen mentioned,
Closer.
What's the saying, the horse is out of the barn, or maybe I'm mixing metaphors, but we've seen this in other areas of health. So one example is prescribing patterns and pharmacy benefit management organizations. A decade or 2 decades ago, there was a lot of access to tremendous amount of prescribing data. And then subsequently, rules and regulations got put in place to basically better manage this. So it's probably better to proactively address these issues and proactively move towards systems in which researchers and policymakers, et cetera, are accessing the data and using the data. Otherwise, we don't know how the data is going to be used, because it will be used.
So we'll take the 2 questions that are here. So Richard?
Richard Black. So first of all, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a really, really interesting and informing session for me. Just quickly on the dog thing. With the advantage of the watch, I'm told, is that it takes heartbeat as well. And so if you get a lot of activity with no heartbeat, it's probably the dog.
Dogs have hearts.
Yeah, but apparently the Apple iWatch wasn't optimized for the, so this is a question for the whole panel, because I've heard, like we've heard today, the different kinds of analyses that you can go after. We've heard the challenge of understanding what's in the food that we're eating, that we've heard how the individual is so different, and I worry sometimes when we aggregate over data in large studies like what comes out of Harvard, we lose that sensitivity on the individual. We know they're responders, non-responders. We've heard the challenge that really, I think of it, wheels within wheels within wheels of the systems approach, and then I've only touched the top 1% of the number of wheels within that. How do we bring that all together into a coherent approach that then allows individual actors, policy, or the food industry, or activity industry, to do something that will matter? Because it's such a complex, interactive situation. It's a rather detailed question there. I don't know Do people get what I'm trying to get at there?
Well, I think you've put some important issues on the table. I'm going to let the panel be thinking about that. I'm going to put another big, everybody on the panel question on the table, and I'm going to ask you to put yours. So basically, we're putting some big topics out. I don't know what your question is, but please.
Yeah, so Jessica Wu from Cincinnati Children's. So it is actually relating to a lot of the different topics that everyone was talking about today, and it relates to both what was just discussed as well as the previous discussion about privacy, which is if we think about getting the most information that we can, you know, and triangulating on what's really going on, that seems to imply that you would need both, you know, sort of personal monitoring as well as contextual information as well as, you know, environmental information and various levels like you were talking about. But the issue then becomes a couple-fold. One is how do you link information about an individual person to some of those broader data sets? And you can do it by geography, but certainly if you're thinking about you know, environmental health or electronic health records, that's, you know, a different kind of animal. I mean, people are talking about using, you know, EHR records on populations, which is great, but if you're trying to follow EHR records for an individual, that becomes much more tricky process. And then if you're thinking about accessing data that might be useful, it might actually be in the hands of industry. And how do we actually get access to that data and use it in a way that's sort of ethically responsible, but allows us to triangulate on some of these other issues. So it seems like we're not only missing sort of big pieces, but there may be linkage issues that may be very difficult, if not impossible, to surmount. And I just want to get people's sense of that as well, sort of from a broad scale.
Okay, so we have from Richard sort of that big picture thinking of all these systems, but eventually we need to understand what does it mean at the individual level. I think you're getting to a point of what are we missing from these data sets and how do we get access to that kind of information that when we put it together. The other big ticket as we think about these various factors that need to come together, how do we prioritize them? And if we were encouraging funding agencies to be thinking about this area, what would we encourage them to prioritize for funding? And if we want groups like ASN or ILSI to be thinking about working and developing pathways forwards, how would we want them to prioritize? So I'm going to start with Regan.
I feel like if I had the answer to that question, I would be in my own private beach somewhere. I think getting to your question, Richard, is how do we integrate all this idea to make some sort of successful intervention for people to be more healthy in this country? And I think what we're missing, a big part of what we're missing, is that we are not making things easy for people. People are stressed out, they're busy, they're not sleeping, they're not exercising because they don't have time because of job demands. We don't have the infrastructures in place to set people up for success. We don't have socialized daycare so parents can have time release away from family obligations outside of work. I think that understanding information from all of these talks that we got here today will help inform how we can build a better infrastructure for success, but I think it's probably a long way away.
Mark, do you want to?
I echo your sentiment of not really knowing, but I think my idea would be to just start on that path by some pilot studies. I don't think we have, in every one of our cases, we have everything worked out to just then sit down and say, how does these pieces come together? In every one of our work, Stephen's area particularly so applicable to doing things efficiently, getting the data as we want. we're still experimenting on that front. But having, even say, here we have what we have, to your question, how do we put it together? There are people who are working on this, and there are some successes. The U.S. Census Bureau, for example, has started on creating a platform, and this platform has reached out to the states to basically sign, write contracts, memorandum of understanding of getting all these administrative records for women, infant, children program, for SNAP program, who's participating, who's in the household, what's their income level, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff coming to the census and being linked probabilistically to their surveys, so a whole bunch of studies can be done, and they're masterful in making sure that privacy and confidentiality is met, who gets the access to the data and for what purpose they're using them. So there are lessons out there to take advantage of.
Stephen?
Well, I think for me, my silly chocolate example is where I think the place to be is, because it's really hard to create interventions or to get messages to people that are going to work if the messages are so mixed. And so I think if we reduce the noise in the measurement, we get clearer answers of what works or what doesn't work. That's going to help us in one way. Another way, I think we just generally have to take risks on trying new things, different types of measures that might seem a little crazy at first. It's the sensor fusion or the information fusion, which is where the power often is, but sometimes that's a hard sell. And I think the Precision Medicine Initiative is a good example of where they're taking big risks and they are trying to combine electronic medical records with individual level behavior with genetic information, and who knows how that will go. It seems very early, and it's a very big risk, but I think that's the type of thing that should be happening, and we'll figure it out. I mean we don't know, but I think we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So Dr. Lee?
So I guess I need to speak closely to this. So I guess several responses. One, regarding Richard's question about how everything fits together. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is when we say a systems approach, that doesn't necessarily mean tackle the entire system at once. And that doesn't mean just aim for very grand answers and solving massive questions. Because if we look at how other fields have transformed their approaches or solved major problems, it's always been stepwise. It's been tackling pieces of the system, better understanding pieces of the system, and then progressively fitting each of these things together. Because when you try to tackle everything together, you just get overwhelmed and you're saying, I don't know where we're at. And it also, you tend to lose that momentum, because if you don't get some early wins, people say, well, okay, where are we going? And I've seen that many times, because I've seen when they say, okay, you're building a model, okay, what's the one thing that's causing obesity? Can we get rid of that? And that's not the purpose of building a model. You're trying to start to represent different systems, and then eventually they'll coalesce. We've seen that many times in the technology world. When the internet search engines first came aboard, their whole purpose was rather modest. No one sat there and said, okay, well, we're going to transform the world and everyone's going to use the word Google, et cetera. I believe they started off as a library search technology. So I think we just want to be cautious about that, but we also want to continue to move forward. And eventually, it's more changing a mindset and changing approach rather than tackling everything at once. And then to address your question about linking these different data sets. So one example is within our center, there's a large, quote-unquote, big data project in Pennsylvania that involves 37 different counties in Pennsylvania. And that's led by Brian Swartz and Tom Glass in our center. And they've been linking EHR records with community data, with epigenetics data, so different types of data sets. So certainly there are challenges, and you don't always have all the gaps filled. But that's an example of, and we probably don't have time to go through the details right now, but that's an example of where they're using different approaches or methods to really try to link these disparate data sets and then looking for the gaps. And that's also certainly going to be one of the interesting growth areas over the next several years. What types of techniques or methodologies do you use to fill these gaps or to connect things which are essentially collected at different scales using different measurements, et cetera?
Well, Bruce just said in a very eloquent manner what I was thinking. I was thinking about a stepwise approach. Not to try to integrate everything because we don't know what everything is. That universe we don't know. So, well, we can get partial answers with the knowledge that we have. But to make sure that in that stepwise approach, every step that we take is solid, is on solid foot. So, and by that means sometimes, yes, you will have to discard pieces that you thought they were solid in the past, but they are not solid according to the new knowledge that we are generating. So, but again, to keep the momentum.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I actually had another question, and I saved it to kind of connect this together to kind of show how I think our kids are going to be critical to solving this problem. So the question was, can imaging or a scanning technology be advanced sufficiently to measure food composition? Well, sufficiently is the key word, but there is a scanner, I believe a Spanish company called Telspec that they've been marketing. I saw they were raising funds on Indiegogo and Kickstarter. And so how do I tie it back to my kids? Well, my children are very active in an organization called FIRST. It's for inspiration recognition of science and technology. And they have a variety of programs around robotics. One is the FIRST Lego League, as in Legos, but they're not the Legos you buy at the store, they're special ones, so Lego can get a little bit of a deal there. But nonetheless, they've been very supportive. So this year's challenge, every year it changes, is called Trash Trek. It's about minimizing waste. So there was a team that actually looked at their school food system, and they wanted to use this scanning technology to identify what types of food were being wasted from a macronutrient level that was included, and then give that feedback to their school administrations so they could choose foods that kids ate and not waste as much. So that's how it is all coming together. And our kids, I mean, my son and daughters, I mean, they do things on, I don't give them my iPhone. They don't touch it because I don't know what they're going to do to it. And if they did something, I probably couldn't fix it. So I think it reflects that these guys here, to use a Matrix comment, they all have taken the red pill, right? So everybody else will be catching up sooner, especially our kids. So I do want to come back to saying thanks, particularly to the ILSI staff again. Heather Steele for the logistical part. Barbara Lyle, she's been tweeting or twitting. I'm not a tweeter person, so I'll say it both because I don't know which one's right or wrong. So she's been tweeting out things during the whole session today. And also Chorsan Koo, who is important from a scientific advisor perspective. Additionally, you might have noticed the video camera right in the middle of the room. There will be videos of the presentations today made available. Is it the ILSI YouTube channel? So you can go onto YouTube and do some searching for ILSI. There's already a variety of presentations up there. Should any other besides these catch your interest, please view them. Last but not least, will you please join in thanking everyone, including our speakers. Everything was outstanding today. So on behalf of myself and Barbara, it was a pleasure to be up here. It was great to see everybody still hanging around towards the end, and enjoy the rest of your Experimental Biology 2016 experience. Thank you.